blend of technology and discussion is very interesting. I've been asked to speak on legal challenges for the future of the Arctic, and I'm going to specifically talk about the Arctic Ocean, not the Arctic in general. In the discussion, it's a collaboration, so I'm speaking on behalf of a large team of individuals, spans the United States, Europe, and Asia. The project involves several funding agencies in the United States and Europe, the National Science Foundation, CNRS, European Commission. There's about 35 partner countries that are involved and probably 40 or so different organizations in those countries. The project that we're working is called Arctic Options, and in specific, it's in contrast to the notion of recommendations. So recommendations carry with them advocacy, involve wordsmithing, involve bias, and often are introduced into policy systems in a way that are seen as intrusive. In contrast, this project has the objective of introducing options that can be used or ignored by the policymakers, but there's no advocacy involved. And the objective is to contribute to informed decision making. The project itself involves several different components in terms of integration. There's a geospatial component looking at different elements and layers of data. There's a knowledge discovery component dealing with text information, different types of treaties and how they're integrated. There's a scenarios component, and all of this feeds into the different types of options. In terms of this discussion, I'd like to try and do this in a way that is helpful. So not just presenting information that is information per se, but to think in terms of what is helpful. So if we look at the Arctic as a region, one of the challenges is to think about it in an inclusive context. So at the center is the Arctic Ocean. Surrounding the Arctic Ocean are Arctic states. And beyond the Arctic states that are coastal states, there are Arctic non-coastal states. And between the coastal states and the non-coastal states, there are also indigenous peoples. Beyond the Arctic states are non-Arctic states. And beyond the states is the international community globally. And so in a sense, this is the challenge for the Arctic, is to think inclusively, because interests are not limited any longer to just those that live in the Arctic region. In terms of domain awareness, which is a component of this discussion, in a sense, domain awareness relates to responding to impacts. And in that sense, the challenge for the Arctic isn't just a matter of research and understanding changes in fisheries or changes in shipping or changes in energy activities or changes in ecosystems. It's a matter of how to respond to those changes. And in a sense, there's a blank slate in terms of the infrastructure that will need to emerge across the 21st century. And I use this definition to broadly think in terms of what needs to emerge for managing, responding to those changes. Clearly, it involves fixed and mobile assets such as ships and ports, as well as other physical assets, including observing, communication, research, and information systems. But also includes regulatory policy as well as insurance systems in terms of understanding how to respond to those changes. To put the Arctic in context, this was a paper that recently came out in the Journal of Geophysical Research. It's a very interesting study. It looks at the ice caps in the Canadian Arctic. And these ice caps progressively are uncovered. And what they've looked at are plants that are rooted to the ground, and they analyze the radiocarbon content of those roots in the ground. If the roots had grown over, the new radiocarbon content would be exposed in those roots. And so in a sense, what they've observed is that the radiocarbon in these roots hasn't been exposed to the atmosphere for at least 47,000 years, which is basically dead radiocarbon. And so we're looking at changes in the Arctic that are unprecedented over tens of millennia. And we're living during that period of those changes, which places a great burden on our generation to figure out solutions that will clearly have relevance generations into the future. In terms of the Arctic sea ice, it is changing at a very dramatic basis. Over 70% of the volume of Arctic sea ice has been lost in just the last 30 years. In just the last 30 years, for whatever reason. Call it anthropogenic, call it natural variability, whatever the reason is, Over 70% of the volume of Arctic sea ice has been lost in the last 30 years. If we think about a room, this room is a system. It's got a floor, it's got walls, it's got a ceiling, it's got inflow and outflow through the doors. If I remove the ceiling to this room and we were suddenly exposed to the rain, the wind, the atmosphere, and so on, our dynamics in this room would change. The system would be different. It would no longer be the same room. And in effect, what's happened to the Arctic Ocean, not decades into the future, not years into the future, but already, is the ceiling to the Arctic Ocean has changed. It is no longer the same system. And because the system is different, there are inherent, not possible, but inherent risks of political, economic, cultural, and environmental instability. These are inherent risks. Those risks are the fundamental questions associated with security in a general sense. So in a sense, what's happened is we have the cause is the change in the sea ice, and in response, it's opening up all kinds of opportunities and new considerations. These are the instabilities that are emerging. We're seeing increased shipping. This is on the left, a change in the surface, a two-dimensional view of the Arctic sea ice, and on the right is a picture of changing sea traffic through the northern sea route. And we can see that in 2008, there were no ships going through the northern sea route, and we've got nearly 100 ships going through with over 1 million tons of traffic annually now. In terms of the policy system, it's very difficult for you to see, but this is time. This is 1987. This is a speech given by President Gorbachev in 1987, which set into motion a number of political developments for the region, including the development of the Arctic Council. So this is 1987, this is 2014, and what you see are policies that are emerging for the Arctic. But suddenly, around 2007, coincident with the planting of a flag at the North Pole, suddenly interest in the Arctic spiked, and it's accelerated ever since. These are policies that are produced by the nations of the Arctic, so all of the Arctic states have their own national security policies. England became the first non-Arctic state to produce a national security policy for the Arctic. The European Commission, Parliament, and Council all are producing policies for the Arctic. The IMO is involved in this discussion. So we have a suite of international players that are accelerating their interests in the Arctic. And the challenge is to think about this interplay. So this is part of the domain. It's not just the ocean itself, it's this entire community of actors that are interacting in new and interesting ways. This just gives you a sense of some of the players. This is the Arctic Council, which is the high-level forum for the Arctic. And all of these red boxes are entities that involve all 8 Arctic states. So the Arctic Council is the high-level forum. It is the principal body of which decisions and activities and discussions, scientific research is coordinated for the Arctic. But there's also the Barents Euro-Arctic Committee. There's the International Arctic Science Committee. There's a new Marine Pollution Preparedness Agreement, the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum, the Search and Rescue Agreement that came out in 2011, Standing Committee of Arctic Parliamentarians, the Spitsbergen Agreement, all involve the 8 Arctic states, plus many more. In the case of the Spitsbergen Agreement, which goes back to 1920, there are 42 nations. The perspectives of the Arctic are all over the place. There are objective perspectives of the Arctic as being the region north of the Arctic Circle. There are perspectives from the law of the sea, from the basis of the sea floor, in terms of claims and extensions of outer continental shelves. There's perspective in the water column and in terms of the high seas and exclusive economic zones. There's perspectives of the Arctic in terms of indigenous peoples. Perspectives in the Arctic in terms of the marine ecosystems and large marine ecosystems around the Arctic, meteorological and navigational areas, and now a new search and rescue agreement. These are all jurisdictional components in terms of the domain that we're all operating in the Arctic. In terms of this infrastructure development, this is a research from a student at the University of Cambridge looking at the relationship between AIS information and sea ice. And I'm very pleased with the collaboration that's emerging with Analyze Corp and SpaceQuest to extend this baseline in a permanent way, because there is data that now exists to set in place a baseline that can be used for operational decision making, where to site ports and so on and so forth. But this demonstrates that there is a relationship between sea ice and AIS information that can be easily mapped. This information exists. All of these red dots in the middle of the ice are ships that are traveling through the ice. In effect, the circumstance today is that the Arctic Ocean is changing. It's now open water from the Bering Strait to the Bering Sea during the summer. So there's open water. The ships themselves, however, can travel in ice-covered areas. There are icebreakers, nuclear icebreakers that can lead convoys, ice-strengthened vessels that are clearly operating in this region. So being in a position to analyze the relationship between ship movement and ice conditions is a fundamental responsibility that we as a community have in terms of understanding. In terms of other impacts in the ocean, because it's opening, there's clearly interest in exploiting the gas and oil. Some of the reserves, the gas reserves, have been taken offline because of the emergence of shale gas as a commodity in the United States, for example. Nonetheless, it's been estimated something on the order of 30% of the global volume of gas and 13% of the global volume of oil exists in the Arctic region. That's a vast amount of energy, and companies are clearly positioning themselves to respond to this. However, there's no infrastructure in place. And following something like the Deepwater Horizon, there was a commission through the U.S. Congress to look at the impacts. And there was one of the staff papers that related to the Arctic and basically observed that there are virtually no Coast Guard vessels in the United States able to respond to any of these issues relating to impacts. And as a consequence, the companies themselves, or the fox in the hen house, has the responsibility at this point in terms of capacity. This is a challenge we have to overcome in terms of assets. The emerging infrastructure is all over the place, but it's very limited, very sparse, and very uncoordinated. So if we think about it, and Michael yesterday gave the analogy of traffic in the United States. He talked about President Eisenhower. However, the analogy goes back a little bit farther. In 1903, 1904, there was a convention in Philadelphia. It was called the National and International Roads Convention. And in this convention, they observed that trucks and cars that were being built were bouncing through mud and potholes and dirt streets and so on. And they observed that they needed to pave roads, not just between cities and large communities and counties, but across continents. And Teddy Roosevelt came to this convention and observed that all great nations build good roads. Well, we're right at the nexus of this change in the Arctic. We, as a generation, are sitting at this point looking at a system where 70% of the surface of the system has disappeared. And we can imagine what this system will look like in terms of the future with ports and ships and communication systems and regulatory systems that don't exist. There'll be a gridded infrastructure with sea lanes and everything else across this region across the coming decades. Planning this and considering this in a thoughtful manner is a responsibility. In terms of the overriding legal framework for the ocean, it is the law of the sea. It is accepted by more than 160 nations. It is in force. Even though the United States hasn't ratified the UN Convention, it accepts the existence of the zones in the ocean under customary international law. So if we go from the land boundary, we go through the territorial sea, through a contiguous zone, into an exclusive economic zone, those all fall within a nation's jurisdiction. Beyond the exclusive economic zone, we have the high seas. That is explicitly defined as beyond sovereign jurisdictions. It is an international space. On the sea floor, we have a continental shelf. That again is on national interests. Beyond the continental shelf, we have the area, or the deep sea. That is clearly beyond sovereign jurisdictions. So in a sense, we've got two components, with two end members. We've got national interests and we've got common interests. And we are extending across this region from the territorial sea into the high seas and the deep sea. The challenge is one of balance. Most of the perspectives of the Arctic are seen from the perspective of the sea floor. The sea floor is legally and physically, ecologically distinct from the overlying water column. For kicks and grins, all of the coastal states surrounding the Arctic could extend their continental shelves to the North Pole. So the entire seafloor of the Arctic could become under sovereign jurisdictions. The point is that even if that occurred, In the center of the Arctic Ocean, beyond the exclusive economic zone, would unambiguously be high seas. And so the Arctic sets in motion a dichotomy, one of balancing national interests and common interests. This dichotomy is not something that's going to disappear. In a sense, the challenge is, right now, the Arctic states are large, powerful nations like the United States, Russia, Denmark, Canada, Norway, looking inward into the ocean. That's the perspective at the moment. There is an opportunity for the international community, which has rights and responsibilities in the high seas, to provide an alternative perspective, to look outward from the center of the ocean in terms of common interests. And this is the challenge that we face. In terms of the types of things that we're looking at in the future, is clearly a matter of balance. Balance between environmental protection, economic prosperity, and social equity, which clearly underlie issues of sustainable development. However, in order for this region to be managed in a consistent way into the future, it has to be stable. In the absence of stability, all of the investments, all of the conservation questions, everything else is moot. So in order to develop stability, it's necessary to think in terms of both promoting cooperation as well as preventing conflict. And this is one of the challenges itself, because there's a lot of effort in promoting cooperation, but when you begin to think in terms of preventing conflict, you begin to think in terms of strategic questions that governments are reluctant to talk about. Clearly, we have a challenge of thinking of the needs of the present and balancing it with the needs of the future. That's a responsibility. And ultimately, we have a challenge in terms of thinking about balance between national interests and common interests. I argue that the Arctic itself is a model, setting in motion precedents that will be relevant to the global community. If we look at the Earth as a system on a planetary scale, 30% of the Earth's surface falls within the boundaries of nations and can be defined in terms of national interests. That means that 70% of the Earth falls beyond the boundaries of nations, which means that 70% of the Earth is represented by common interests. The challenge we face as a civilization is one of balancing national interests and common interests. It's a responsibility that we all share, and the Arctic will open precedents for that into the future. Thank you very much.
And I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question to Sabine, since it's her laptop. I'll answer one question.
Yes, please.
There was a report that came out this last Wednesday that the United States and other entities are ill prepared for a oil spill in the Arctic. And with the increase in traffic, increasing exploration, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that specifically on this.
So it is. So we have in 2011 the first agreement that was agreed by all 8 Arctic states. It was a search and rescue agreement. In 2013, there was a marine pollution preparedness agreement. Those 2 agreements are in place. However, they're hollow in the sense that there isn't the infrastructure in place to respond to them. And so it's one of those disconnects. There's an actual conflict between the policy that's been developed and seen as well-intentioned and the ability to implement it. And that's one of the things that is a challenge to overcome.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sabina Jessen. I'm the National Director of the Oceans Program for an NGO in Canada called the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. And as our name implies, one of the main things we work on is on protected areas, but we're also involved in marine spatial planning. And I'm going to take you from that big picture that Paul just presented on the whole Arctic Ocean and that kind of international to something smaller and more focused in BC. It's one of the things we're working on. It's a campaign that we're quite excited about as well, and I think it does highlight a number of the issues that we've been talking about over the past few days, and I hope it'll be something that will also tweak your interest, because it's a demonstration of the fact that we are still discovering new exciting things in the ocean. And one of those things is something called glass sponge reefs that are found nowhere else in the world. And you might ask, what are they? So the more scientific name is hexactinolid sponges. They are built solely out of silica, which is why they're called glass. And they build a skeleton that stays in place after the animal dies, which allows then these reefs to be built. So in 1988, this is a video of the reefs found on the north coast of British Columbia. And the red areas are the actual sponge reefs. So they were discovered during seafloor mapping in 1988. A scientific paper was published in 1991. And it wasn't until 1997 that the paper that was published came to the attention of this man, Dr. Manfred Krauter from Germany. And he had studied the fossilized sponge reefs that are found all over Europe, shown in that photo from the Danube Valley. And it was thought that these sponge reefs had gone extinct in the Jurassic era with the dinosaurs. So we have been working on trying to get these protected since 2001, when they really came to our attention through publications that the scientists from their research had discovered. So Manfred Krauter actually jointly worked with the Geological Survey of Canada, because when they did the seafloor mapping, what they found were these funny lumps on the seafloor, and they didn't know what they were, and they did send down an ROV to have a look. And that's when they figured out that it must be these kind of glass sponge reefs, but they didn't really realize how significant their discovery was until Dr. Krauter came across a paper in 1997. And he said the significance of this discovery would be like finding a herd of dinosaurs on land. That's how significant this discovery is. And he said when he came across the paper that they had published, he just about fell off his chair, that the things that he'd been studying in fossilized form were alive still somewhere in the ocean. So in 2002, after a lot of pressure from us, the federal government instituted fishing closures, because what we discovered is that trawlers, groundfish trawlers, which were very active in this region, were destroying the sponge reefs. And the scientists have estimated about 50% of the reefs were destroyed before we got the fishing closures in place. We got those in place, and then we campaigned to get marine protected area status for them. And that marine protected area should be announced this year. And so there are two components of what we've been trying to do, which is to get them protected from direct impacts from fishing activities, mostly trawling. And secondly, to address the issue of sedimentation, because they're a sponge and they filter and they have to pump. And so if there's a lot of sediment on them, they get smothered. So we're also trying to address, through a larger boundary around the area, the issue of sedimentation. And we have to push very hard to make that happen. So this one is moving along. You should hear an announcement sometime later this year that Canada has a new marine protected area. This will be the next one, so you've heard it here first. But in 2001, the Geological Survey did more seafloor mapping closer to Vancouver. And I'm not sure if you can see that. Is it the? Oh, I'll just point it out. This is Vancouver here, Greater Vancouver area. And this is Vancouver Island, and south of here is the city of Victoria. So around the Strait of Georgia, there's over 1 million people that live in this region. And when they did seafloor mapping here, lo and behold, they found a bunch of smaller sponge reefs. So we've been working for 5 years to try to get them to close fishing around these sponge reefs. And we are finally in a process to do that. And it's through meeting Jennifer through an email, through another contact who told her about the work we were doing. And we are right now in the process of sitting down with the federal government and the fishing sectors, because there's quite a lot of fishing going on here, to try to get these fishing closures put in place. And we have a number of challenges, and I'll get into that in a moment, but I'll just tell you a little bit more about these sponge reefs, because they really are very important ecologically. And I'm going to talk a bit more about their filtering, because there's been some exciting new research around that. And I already mentioned that they can build these reefs. And I forgot to tell you that those reefs in northern BC are the height of an 8-story building. And the reefs in the Strait of Georgia are the height of a 5-story building in places. Now you won't always see that if you take a look at it, because the old dead sponges, they get kind of silted in, and it's the live sponges that are growing on top. But if you really look at it, and they go back, they date back 9,000 years. So basically since just after the end of the Ice Age in BC, when the ice retreated, that's when they started growing, when that northern area was flooded. And they have done some looking at what are all the species that are sort of in and among these sponge reefs. And they have found that, well, Dr. Crowder likes to call them rockfish kindergartens. And we've been calling them nurseries because they do find a lot of juvenile rockfish and many other species sort of hidden in among, because they provide such complex habitat on the seafloor. But in terms of filtering, it's absolutely astonishing because they basically filter out bacteria out of the water column, and that's what they feed on. And these are the numbers which they've just, Dr. Sally Lays at the University of Alberta and her students have come up with. So each day, one sponge filters between 9,000 and 17,000 liters of water. And a single sponge reef, like one of the small ones in the Strait of Georgia, they've estimated can filter the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool every 40 seconds. So it's like, so we don't even know how important is that in the ecosystem that they're found in. And there's so much we don't know. We don't know about their reproduction. We don't know how fast they grow. So there's a lot of stuff we don't know. But we know that they must be important if they're operating at this kind of level. So here's a video of one of the sponge reefs off one of the Gulf Islands near Victoria, just to give you a sense. So the dark down here is probably some of the dead old sponges, and all the white that you see is live sponge growing on top of that.
What's the depth there?
The ones in the Strait of Georgia, I don't know for this particular one, they're around like 80 to 100 meters, and the ones in northern BC about 200 meters deep. So they're pretty deep. There are a few in the Strait of Georgia that are diveable, but it's you can't go down for long because they're still probably at about 70 meters. But people are diving on some of the shallower ones. But the larger ones don't tend to be as accessible. Sorry, it's a bit of a longer video than I realized, but it does give you a pretty good sense. And actually the visibility is really good here right now, so you do get a bit of a sense of the extent of them. I might just, I think it's going to go on a bit long. But as I mentioned, they are threatened. Trawling is a big threat. There's traps. So I forgot to say that the consistency of an individual sponge, think of a meringue. Somebody else, the analogy was to one of those prawn crackers, so they kind of almost feel like that. And so you can just imagine, something, a trap falls on them or a trawl goes through, they just smash them to smithereens. There's really nothing left. And this is a little sort of animated thing of the trawler going through, and kind of what's left. It's just rubble that's left. And there's another little video of an area that's been damaged where you see lots of broken sponges and a lot of silt. And then the problem you have here is that the sponges need hard substrate, either another sponge or a rock or something, in order to regrow. They can't grow, they can't attach to when it's all broken up or to the silt. I wasn't able to bring my sidekick, Mr. Stinky, with me, but he's been a very effective mascot for the campaign. So this is actually a glass sponge that the NRCan, our Geological Survey scientists, gave us to help raise public profile. I've flown with him across the country and taken him to Parliament Hill. We've had photo ops with him, with people, members of Parliament. And this is the former Fisheries Minister of Canada, and this is the current one. And I make sure they all meet Mr. Stinky. And when that article first came out in one of our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, I was getting all these calls from Ottawa, from the minister's office saying, "Who's Mr. Stinky?" So anyway, we've had